You're listening to We Are STS, a podcast from the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. Hi, everybody. Welcome to WeAreSTS, and welcome to UCL. Hi, everybody. I'm your host, Professor Joe Kane. We're affected every day by decisions that get made about standards. Standards determine the shape of our electrical plugs, the quality of our water, the signals that get used in our phones, and so much more. But standards, they don't just happen. They're decided. Sometimes that's done by one company, and sometimes that's done in international deliberation. Talking about standards is classic work in STS. Standards constrain, and they also enable. It matters who gets to decide which standards we use, as well as the ones we don't use. Standard setting can affect our lives for generations, and they can cost us or profit us to the tune of trillions of pounds. Luckily, here in STS, we have an expert on standards. Dr. Saheli Datta Burton is lecturer in science policy. She's recently co-authored a kind of risk analysis for the way standards are being set these days across a huge range of subjects. She's looking for patterns, trends, and hotspots. The conclusions her study reaches, I'd say, are profoundly worrying from the British perspective. Simply put, we do not have our act together in this subject, and it's going to come back to bite us hard if we're not careful. To hear more about Saheli's work and how students can get involved, I asked her to come into the studio for a chat. We started our conversation simply with Saheli introducing herself.
My name is Saheli Datta Burton. I am a lecturer in science policy in this department.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. You're here because you've published a paper, right? Why don't you tell
exciting.
us? It is exciting, isn't it? Just in a nutshell, before we talk about it in detail, what is this paper about?
If you think of the international system, there is geopolitical competition, and this increasingly revolves around harnessing emerging technologies like AI, quantum, AI-enabled health technologies, and what have you. Standard setting, if you think about it, is a central element of this international competition, meaning that states seeking to shape the technology landscape are actively trying to increase their influence in international standard setting bodies. But this paper is about how two traditional leaders are responding to the rise of China in standard setting bodies, where China appears determined to participate fully in the processes and benefits of this rule-making game, which is standard setting.
Okay, so that's a really great way to frame what we're doing. Let's see if we can have an example to work with. And the example I was thinking of is the plugs that go into the wall socket. And so you take that simple example, and everybody knows who's traveled to a different location. They know they have to worry about the plugs, right? Whatever you plug in, you need a different plug, and maybe there's different voltage, and so you've got to adjust. And the question everybody always asks is, why can't we just have one, right? And in a way, that's standard setting, right?
Yes, that's an excellent example. It's right here, there's plugs. Why don't we have one standard plug globally? But that would mean that essentially somebody or some country or some standard setting body said that our plugs is the best plugs in the world and that should be used. And therein you have this question of, why should they be the ones to say that? Who gives them the power to decide that this is the best? By what metrics has it been decided that this plug is the best instead of that one? Yeah. What does that mean in terms of the economic and political space that it creates for the manufacturers of this plug? So if the country where the plug manufacturers are based, say, for example, is in country A, then they get to keep all the licensing fees for making these plugs and the various, patenting fees that comes with it. So there's there's a huge, this kind of economic political landscape pathway that builds around setting these standards.
Yeah.
And that's really, the meat of what we're trying to get to here.
Yeah, that's fantastic because who decides which plug is the best plug? And of course, everybody thinks theirs is the best. And not only that, but I've got a lot of money invested in the plugs that I have, and I don't want to buy more plugs or different ones, or my house has one system. And if I need to change all the plugs in my house, it's going to cost, who's going to pay for that? So you've got, again, I think of a way to really have a simplistic example would be the plugs in the wall. And this idea that all around the world, there are different approaches to how to put plugs in walls, but deciding which is the best is one thing. Deciding which one everybody uses is another thing. And then just the change that we have to go through to get everybody standardized. Nice. That's the power word, isn't it? Yeah. That's one of the biggest, first messages I take away from your paper is the fight is on to make decisions over who gets to make the standards.
Yeah.
And what are the consequences of those decisions for everybody else?
No, exactly. So what this paper says is that's exactly right. But then this is not a new game. It's been going on since the early 19th century and even earlier. So this kind of tussle between is yours better or is mine, if I say yours is better, then how much change does it entail? How much of my economic landscape changes? How much profit do I make from it? What do I stand to lose? So these questions have been around for years.
For years.
Yes.
And there's, of course, there's a lot of money involved, and there's a lot of different kinds of money involved. And what I like about your analysis here is you're talking about it not just in terms of the retail market, but also in terms of a really long-term strategic thinking that says, look, if we're not at the table talking about standards, we're going to be at a long-term disadvantage because somebody else's standard is going to apply and we're going to have to do what they do, whether we like it or not. And frankly, we don't like it. Right. And that in a way is a simplistic way, again, to kind of summarize the China perspective is to say, look, we've been playing somebody else's game for a long time. We want to play our game. And the consequence of that could be a lot of other people are going to be not even asked, because it's not a choice. It's not asked to do it, but required to follow along. And so in the geopolitical universe, people are watching this going, hey, hang on a minute. Have we lost sight of something? Yeah. Am I understanding that kind of broad chess game?
No, absolutely. I think you've succinctly kind of encapsulated the whole thing in a nutshell. And the only thing perhaps I would add to that technology is also another space for this rule making, for this rule to establish the rules of the game, where you've had these traditional rule takers and you've had the rule makers. And now China, if we see it from the perspective of the historical trends of standard setting, was a rule taker. And now that it has the economic power, it is saying, no, I'm no longer happy with that. So I'm going to change the landscape of rule making now and see where that takes us. So this gives a kind of historical look as to why we came to this question. Why do we have China competing with the US and Europe, who've been there for more than 100 years, 150 years in this game? Why they feel that this is time to change the rules and let another rule maker into the global forum of where these rules are being made.
Right. Now, I want to just ask a question about that forum. What is it like? I mean, is there a kind of a literal table where policymakers sit around and then they decide now that there's another rule maker? Do they just add another chair, or is it more complicated than that?
No, it's exactly that. It is really the metaphorical chairs. It's voting rights in these forums. So in these standard setting bodies, you have, the number of members, you get one vote per member. However, there is no restrictions as to how many members a certain company may have. So if there are, for example, 300 members, of the 300 members, 50 of them could belong to one company.
One company?
One company. And that's a very interesting point that you bring up here, company, because this standard setting so far, it's supposed to be the domain of technical people, technical bodies, of professionals, technologists. This is not a domain where the state was traditionally or has been a part of it, because it's supposed to follow the noble ideal of, technology is not a space for politics. It's about talking about the technical things. It's about deciding what is good about this technology, what is bad about the technology, what should be standardized or not. The whole kind of idea behind standard setting is this, fluffy idea that, okay, there's no politics involved in here. But this has simply not been the case, as history shows and as we can see currently.
Mm-hmm. And that's what makes it STS, doesn't it? It's the idea that there's a sociology here, there's an anthropology here. And you use the example of, say, like an engineering standard. Yeah. What's the best plug to use in a wall socket? Well, let's ask the engineers, what's the best one? What's the most versatile one? Whatever. And the engineer will give us a technical answer. But then you step back and say, hang on a minute. Well, how come everybody just hasn't rationally accepted that? Yeah. Well, it's because we're not rational. There's a lot more going on. There's politics, there's sociology, there's preference, there's economics, there's all kinds of things. And so the things we have are a consequence of all those things. It's not just being the technically best. Yeah. And STS is filled with loads of examples where sort of the engineering better technology gets blown away by something else that is either economically supported, politically supported, etc. Right? Yes. I mean, the PC Mac is a great example. The old style videotape examples. There's loads of examples where people will say technical, and so that again gets to the gist of your part of your study, which is the people who are at the table. We might naively think that they're engineers and they're rationally thinking this through. The technologists, but in fact, who they are politicians or company manufacturers who are shilling for their own device one way or another. Right. And in a way, there's a power dynamic going on around the table. Is that right?
I mean, this is a space where STS definitely comes in, because it's not just what you were talking about, what's happened in the past and how it's been constructed, this particular technology. One may like to think that the only consideration there was the technical, but it's not. There are so many other non-technical, social, ethical, political, economic considerations. And a key part of that is also the promise of these technologies. So they have a promissory value in the sense that these technologies promise to bring in immense economic gain to whoever has power over them, or what is called in business first mover advantage. So if the first movers of the game are able to establish their power, their rules of how this game will be played. In the case of the plugs, the first kind of manufacturers or the ones who came up with the idea of the plugs, they establish, this plug will be 3-pin, it'll go into a wall which will have, this number of pins, this. All the equipment, all the goods that we will manufacture then will have that kind of socket which will go into this wall socket. This has kind of builds this picture, this vision of future where you can see not just the plug and what goes in the wall, but all of these electronic gadgets now start to follow this standardized plug design. So that means you have this big economic picture in mind. The promise of it is what is making states get into this game, because they realize there's so much economic potential to this, and not being part of it would mean, or what we now call fear of left behind. Right. It's not just that, but fear of left behind means we also become rule takers. We pay licensing fees. Our industry suffers. I can't remember the exact study, but one of the studies looked at and said that once you have a patent on a technology, it establishes economic gains for that piece of technology for about 25 years. Wow. So you see the promise of the future is an integral part of standard setting. So it's very STS intersecting with international political economy, with international politics, and very geostrategic in that sense.
Yeah, so you can see how it kind of can snowball. Yes. And as you're in there first and you get to set the standard, you start start getting the income first. That means you're a richer company or country, and then you can invest in more and you can get the jump, as it were, on everybody else. I guess the long-term strategic vision is to say, the more we can do that, the larger we can create the snowball. And so we'll be much better off in the long run. And so let's get to the table and let's start influencing those standards. Either say no to things that we don't want or say yes to things that we do want. And that way we can block others. And I think you're kind of watching this from above and saying, hang on a minute, there's a not game, that's the wrong word for it, but there are tactics being played in the room that we need to notice. We need to notice these things. And now you do pick up a couple of patterns in your paper. And so like the first mover is one of the patterns that you identify. Are there other patterns that you identified that you thought were particularly worth noting?
Yes, there is also, if you will, this kind of private enterprise, which is a big part of standard settings. As I was saying earlier, standard setting has been the domain of technologists, of engineers. Many have argued over the years, where does politics come into it? In the rooms, it should be just technology. And that has been another part of the tussle, is between the private sector, between what is called the multi-stakeholders kind of governance, instead of just the state being a big part of making the rules of the game. So this paper also essentially brings out another theme, which is the state or countries and governments had stepped back from standard setting during the Reagan-Thatcher years. But after the late 90s, from early 2000s, when it started kind of becoming apparent toward the technology domain, the technology itself was changing, becoming more international, global, not in the sense that, yes, the plugs are used globally, but in the sense of internet, which cannot work if it is not global. If you don't have a critical mass of global population logging into the internet and using it, this technology is just useless.
Right.
It just doesn't work. So in that sense, once you start having that, then from, say, around 2011, 12, 13, you see a kind of interest in the states starting to take interest and coming back into this fray of standard setting and realizing that standard setting used to be during the world wars a part of the industrial policy, and it needs to be that again, because the economic promise of technologies that are now emerging are so great, rather, that if the states don't intervene and make it and promote it, help it to grow, if the states don't intervene, then there is a chance that the state itself will be left behind.
Right, and that idea that the politicians took their eye off standard setting as an arena where power is exercised. I think, again, you pick that up really nicely in this project. And you say, hang on a minute, if you're asking people to sit around the table and you invite different countries and only a few show up, the ones who don't come are making a big mistake, right?
Yes, but that's the kind of the social justice part of it as well, is that these global forums of standard setting, or what we call Standard Development Organization, SDOs, we just see actors from the US and Europe, and lately from China and a few other countries. The rest of the countries have just accepted that they are rule takers. Right. It just takes too much resources to be part of this game. Right. And there is a movement among a lot of the standard setting organizations to make it easier for a lot of the countries to participate. But a lot of the participation, on paper at least, has to be by the private sector. A lot of the private sectors in especially the transitioning and developing economies do not feel that they have the resources and the capacity to participate.
Right.
So that is another kind of dynamic, and it's worth exploring.
If a student came in and said that's colonial, well, how would you respond to that? The idea of standard setting as a colonizing process. Do you think that that's the right vocabulary to use?
So far, it has not been thought of in particular those terms, because it has rather been thought of as a relic or a legacy of colonization rather than it being a colonizing process, because these global forums are really very open in the sense whoever wants to gain membership has to just, in some places it is subscription based for a nominal fee. Some cases it's part of the national delegation that takes part of it. It's really kind of an open membership, if you will, but the membership or the members has to be most of the time the private sector, and they must feel empowered and not feel that this is just a tokenistic participation for them to feel like, yes, if I participate, it'll really mean something for my, project, for the technology I'm working on. It'll ultimately, push me forward in the global value chain, make me some kind of, or at least take the first steps towards becoming or participate in rulemaking.
I take an example of Apple computers.
Oh, excellent example.
Yeah. I think consumers who buy Apple have a common experience of every once in a while, Apple will change all the connectors and all the wiring. And then we have to run out and get new connectors and come back. And the adapter to connect one thing to another is so expensive. And in a way, there's a moment of everyone shaking their fist at Apple saying, oh, you're just trying to make money out of us. And their response is, no, this is technically better. Don't be cynical. Be an engineer. We're making a technically better decision here. And you'll enjoy it in the long run. So just suck it up. Yeah. I mean, first of all, do you think I described that accurately?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's the best way to, it's exactly it. Like, we have made the rules of the game. Now you take it. There's no other option. If you want a Mac, if you want an Apple laptop, phone, whatever, you have to change your charges. So this is where the states need to have some oversight of the process. They need to intervene and say, well, they have said, right, in this case, that this game can't go on.
Right.
Because you have this consumer protection. You have this consumer whom you need to protect from, shall we say, the darker side of standard setting and the economic disadvantages that it can bring with it. And for that, I think that the fact that the states are back in has its pluses, but then there are some minuses as well.
So how are the states back in that example? I'm thinking about like the European Union has announced that phones have to use a standardized connector.
Yes. So previously in the 80s and the 90s, the state definitely stepped back and said it's a very kind of laissez-faire economy, the standard setting, whatever technical aspects are decided is right. That is what should be standardized. That should be the rule of this game. Regulation is very bordered. You regulate citizens. You cannot regulate global customers. But then EU as a global actor, as a global standard setter, there's lots of work around that. There's lots of studies around that. So that is definitely helpful in the sense that if the European Union raises the standards, then a lot of the countries who access the European market will also have to raise the standards to gain access to this market, to trade within this market, to access the customers within this market, to access the customers' data within this market. So in that sense, a key global leader, actor of the standard setting game, if they raise the standards, if they raise the bar in consumer protection, then it raises, hopefully, the standards globally.
You talk about coercion in standards, and that the Apple example strikes me as it's coercion in two ways. One is Apple saying to the world, hey, we're Apple. If you want to use our products, you have to follow us. Yeah. And then the EU is another example of coercion, looking back saying, hang on a minute, we're a really big market, and if you want to sell apples here, then you have to do what we want. And I suppose it's both of those examples of coercion are predicated on the idea that it's a bit of a compromise. We're forcing you to do it, but we promise you this is a good solution, right? We're not arbitrarily saying, okay, everybody has to use AAA batteries and that's it, simply because we happen to sell them. That's I suppose we think of it as bad coercion. Whereas the example of Apple is the promise is it's actually there's a superiority in the engineering, and the EU is saying it's actually going to help consumers in the long run. So we're all asked to bend a bit for the promise of something. in the future. Focusing on the very specific paper, then we'll widen out and talk about you and your research. But is there anything else in the paper per se that you want to make sure that listeners pay attention to?
What would be really interesting if, future researchers take this forward to kind of delve into the various instances and cases and controversies within this historical trends that we've tried to bring out in the paper, and how that is shaping technology till today, even now. This kind of mindset, industrial policies that were made and continue to be so, how this shaping technology development that we use in our daily lives.
Right. So a teacher talking about technology and could easily look at anything and just simply ask, what is the standard that influences the design and construction of this thing? And who set that standard? What is the conversation? And does it vary in different parts of the world? The wall plugs is a great example. But anyway, we'll leave the teachers to think that through. This is a good spot for me to come in, just so we can take a short break.
My name is Ellie, and I'm a medical student studying for the IBSc program at STS. What I love about STS is the freedom it gives you to study a wide range of different topics across different disciplines.
My name is Junaid, and I'm a master's student here in STS. What I love about STS is that it brings together students from different backgrounds. I love hearing from people that have studied STEM, the humanities, and the arts.
Let's get back to my interview with Dr. Saheli Datta Burton. We're talking about her research into how standards are getting set these days and how anyone interested in innovation studies needs to sit up and notice the patterns. Let's widen out to talk a little bit more about your own research, Saheli. And you're a lecturer in science and technology studies. Your expertise is in science and technology policy. Where does this kind of project fit into the broader research that you do?
So I think that answer to that is two-layered. So first, when we started doing this project, we did this while working for the UK government standards team, which is based in the UK Department of Culture, Media and Sport. So this standard teams came to UCL looking really to share knowledge in standard setting, about the history of standard setting, as well as, during our discussions, what came out was there are very few experts or students who were going into standard setting from academia. I mean, they were graduating, they were going to various technology jobs and other kinds of jobs in law, in sociology, in science, but not in standard setting. And that is a key area where a lot of the states now are interested in sending, delegations to be part of this global forum and to negotiate. And what we find is that standard setting, that is the global forums of standard setting, really can be very closed-door events. So you see a lot of these voting and a lot of these exchanges, a lot of these standard setting discussions taking place behind closed doors where states don't have access. Through that also, we kind of got a sense that it would be really key to interest a lot more of our students and our graduates to consider this as an avenue of investigation and future research.
I find fascinating that people working in civil service say that students aren't interested in the topic, partly because, just curious to hear people say people are interested in my thing, but also the idea that, universities today are just filled with students who say, I want to talk about power. I want to talk about who has it and who doesn't. I want to talk about social justice. I want to talk about decolonization. I want to talk about deracialization. I want to talk about all these things. And I want to get to the meat of where the power sits. And it strikes me that this project says it is around the table when we decide what standard do we use for one computer to connect to another. And you might think that's boring, but that's where power really sits. I mean, again, that's what I take away from the project. But and I find it fascinating that university academics like you are talking to government civil servants about essentially power politics in an arena that undergraduates don't even think about. That's really exciting. It's like you're watching the real thing. Whereas students might want to talk about power in some academic theoretical sense. How do you get students to move their focus from the theoretical aspects of power relationships to these very specific examples? Or do you find that they jump in quickly?
What I do in my teaching and my modules is kind of bring this out, the concepts and the theories that frame this kind of research. I really talk about the case studies. So talk about these standards, these specific case studies. One of them is the standards wars around telecommunications technologies, around 2G, 3G, 5G.
Right.
And that really brings out the power dynamics, how power works in the standard setting forums, in these rooms where people actually sit around the table, round table, a square table, and they talk about, whose standard should become the standard for, the world population. And these are the kind of, power dynamics, but also involved in there is a lot of consideration of economics, of, social justice. So these are very important, considerations. And I try to bring these out through very real world case studies in my lectures. And I find students do get quite a lot of, interesting facts and things out of it, and do get interested in understanding a bit of more about these, the interplays and where the spaces where these happen.
Yes.
I think one really cool example is Apple. So it worked with the standard setting lobbies around Wi-Fi for a long time. And it so happened that by the time the Wi-Fi was standardized, the Apple already knew that it was going to be standardized, and they were the first company in the world to have laptops with inbuilt Wi-Fi in it. So once you have that, you already have an advantage. You already have these computers out there, and, people are buying into it. It's something new, and you kind of set the path for the rest to follow. You are the first mover in the game, and that gives you early bird advantages.
And it's nice to see that language. I mean, I've heard for years now us in STS talk about governing emerging technologies. And what I really love about digging into your project is we're not just talking about should we do this or shouldn't we do this. So should we clone or shouldn't we clone? But then digging into, well, if we are going to go ahead, how do we do it? How do we actually tactically move forward? And listening to experts make all those decisions is in a way what you do, and you're noticing certain patterns to how they make those decisions and how they want to govern themselves. And then how other people looking in saying, hang on a minute, let's either maximize our advantage or minimize our loss, or even just think strategically.
Yes, and it underlines another kind of dynamic, which is geopolitics. Part of this paper was looking at how these leaders are also dealing with this changing landscape among themselves. Because there is this economic promise of this, AI, internet, quantum technologies, Internet of Things, all of these things. These are global. The consumer base is global. So whoever is first mover has an advantage in this, can really set the rules of the game for years to come, which means that they can drive economic benefits of it for years to come as well. And therein you see this kind of dynamics between the European Union on one side, which is pushing for more state involvement instead of the multi-stakeholder. So you have the multi-stakeholder side, which essentially means a lot of private companies get to have the rules of the game, which is, do technologists, the multi-stakeholders, the private sector have say in this? Should they be the ones making the rules, or should it be states, the sovereign, making the rules?
Right.
So you have this kind of, you might hear this word being thrown around a lot, digital sovereignty, and you have multi-stakeholderism. So there is underlining that. There's the politics of, should we let all of these big tech companies, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, all of these tech companies make the rules of the game, or should it be EU, the US, the UK, the China, states making the rules of the game? So it's it's all entangled, intersecting. All of these come together.
You threw in a really, really important idea there, digital sovereignty. Say what that is?
So it's really this idea that the country has a right over the use of this technology within its borders. So should it be bordered? So for example, if you take the example of the EU's position on data flow. So it says personal data cannot flow out outside these borders. So that makes it problematic, say, for companies and for technologies like the internet or social media, which extracts data from various data sources, including citizens and people, to make this technology work.
Okay, right. So the example I would think of is, the recent case in the UK of rioting, and there's people in other
from
countries
outside,
who are saying things that may or may not be inciting violence, and the enforcement mechanisms here are looking at those, saying, hang on a minute, just because you're in that part of the world doesn't mean you're not subject to our laws. So you may find yourself in court here, baby, if you're not careful, right? And that is expressing a sovereign concept in the digital universe.
So that is one of the ways. There is no fixed definition for what it is, but it's more of an idea that the sovereign, the borders, should be able to, or those who rule within the borders, make the rules, make the regulations within the borders, should have some right over how this technology is used or not abused or not misused. They should have control over this technology within their borders. So that is this digital sovereignty idea, which clashes with this idea that we, again, see it thrown around a lot, multi-stakeholderism, which really is a multi-stakeholders, which is essentially has come to mean a lot of the tech companies. In the ideal world, it was supposed to include small and medium enterprises. Really, can small and medium enterprises participate in the same forum with the likes of Facebook and Amazon? Right. It cannot. So it has essentially come to mean multi-stakeholderism, that it will be letting in these big tech companies into making the rules of the game, rather than the sovereign, which is the country controlling its borders. It is these unbordered, borderless technologies and their masters, if you will, making the rules of the game, rather than countries having control over what goes on within my borders. Right.
And again, I think an easy way to summarize that is all the arguments going on about what age is a minor. And is it what a country says, or is it what a digital platform says? And whenever I look at a platform that says we define a minor as being whatever, I think, well, who put you in charge?
Who put you in charge?
But again, that's
the key to it. Who is going to make the rules? And that is one of the underlining themes of this. Is the states are coming back in because of exactly this kind of tension.
Mm-hmm. And I love this STS side of it, which is the anthropologist watching the processes going on here and saying, look, it isn't just about raw power. There's an awful lot of finesse here. And what STS brings to the game is the anthropologist's observational skill, and then trying to understand broader kind of processes. So there you go, folks. That's what we need STS for. It's helping policy interested people become more astute observers of things so that they can be better at what it is they want to do.
And that's really part of my research. What I look at is to see how micro practices, how things that go around the table in small rooms, in small, decision-making forums, have global impact for years to come.
And you can imagine some meeting at some social media platform that's hugely popular with young people where they just say, no, I think a minor is 11 and under. And just that simple comment by the board of directors or the chief shareholder or something.
Yes.
And that can have implications around the world for millions of people.
Yes.
That simple thing. And again, okay, so there we go. We've got sovereignty and power and strategy and all those things brought together.
So what really got me interested and what really made me just sit back and the light went off is like, whoa, this little fact that the Wi-Fi, what we use everywhere globally, this Wi-Fi protocol, this came out of this working group 11 of just about 7 or 8 people who made the standard for the Wi-Fi protocol that we use globally today. If they hadn't standardized that, the prices would not have been amenable for us to use it globally.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, just a few people can make a
change everything for years and years and years.
And what feels like
that is fascinating. 7 people, 6 people, 5 people around the table make a rule, and if everything changes, how does that happen?
Fantastic. And that is a nice way to connect a student's interests, say, in politics and sociology, bring it together to talk about something like governing emerging technologies, which feels like a very engineering concept. But no, it's a citizen engagement concept. We all have a stake in this, and STS is a way to get in there. Right. Let me ask you a couple more questions, and then we'll be done. What's next? So when people finish a project, they often think that there's something next. And so what's next for you?
So I'm taking this into 2 different directions. One is taking it into health technologies, which is looking at standards in deciding health technology. So standards for kind of say any kind of new medical device or any kind of new medical technology. Who makes the standards? So a key part of medical technologies is, say, for example, you have the cytotoxicology tests. So essentially, in simple words, you're testing if this thing is toxic for humans or not.
Right.
That is a safety of, humans who take this medicine or use this medical technology, right? Will they, have adverse effects? Will it be fatal? It's kind of taking the same things that we've been talking about into the world of health technologies, which is really was my focus area until I moved off into more data-driven health technologies. So I'm looking at now exploring these ideas through data-driven health technologies. So in the sense, most health technologies now are driven by the amount of data that is there available. It's stratified medicine or personalized medicine. It uses, at times, not all the time, AI. So looking into that, who is making the standards there.
Right.
So, and their standardization is crucial. And again, the consumer is global and the economic prospects are immense. Is there geopolitics? I'm convinced there is. But how does this work? And that was the second strand of my research, is again looking into these rooms where these standards are made. So the anthropology, ethnography of these decision-making processes, not just once the decision has been made, but how do we get to the point where people who sit around the table, and who are these people? Why do they get to sit around that table? Is there any specific reason why some others don't sit around that table? So it's very STS in that sense, kind of looking into and asking these questions. Who decides who should make the rules? Who decides who should not be included in, these kind of testing and standards? So.
Right. I mean, there's a very topical example that comes to mind from what you're saying, and that is a recently announced decision not to use a certain drug in early stages of dementia, and not to provide it on the NHS. Right. And the idea is that it just isn't good enough for the amount of money it costs. Yes. And the argument, of course, the media covered it by asking people who are advocates for more research in the area, saying, come on, it's something, it's better than nothing, and try to drive it forward. But the responses, I thought, were really ineffective in terms of saying why we can't have it, even though it works a little bit. But once you drilled into the reasons that they gave was, look, it's not just the cost of the pill, it's the cost of the treatment. treatment. And the treatment requires lots of scanning, which means you need lots of scanners. Right. It means lots of side effects.
You just don't have the infrastructure to enable that treatment. Yeah.
Exactly right. And so the idea is who gets to sit around the table to make the decisions. Yeah. It seems to me like in that case, the advocates of more dementia treatment felt like they weren't around the table enough, or they weren't the loudest voice, whereas the people responsible for managing the healthcare system seem to have a really much more powerful voice in the decision-making world. Who's at the table and who isn't at the table is where you're hitting. And it sounds to me like that's a lifetime of research.
Yes, agreed. But I think there's a lot of opportunities to take this research in various different strands, and a lot of opportunities for new researchers to join in the, shall we say, game.
I love the way you snuck that in. It's not just opportunities for new research, meaning for me, lots of opportunities for new researchers, meaning...
Because it's an immense field. And the thing is, STS and international relations has not really worked together on this that much. So there is an immense amount of space. I rather need to do more of this research to understand this more. And you can sense this kind of among governments, that there is a real urgency to have more people who understand both sides of this, the technical side as well as the SDS side, shall we say, who understand regulation, why it's made, the sociology, the anthropology, social, all of these things in one bag, shall we say, which is very difficult. And on the opposite side, understand the technical part of it as well. Bring these two together to represent countries on these tables and, take forward the national interest, take forward global interest, global publics.
That's fantastic. I think you've set up a fantastic research program for yourself. You have given ideas for why we should be recruiting into STS more and what these people can do. In short, change the world. And that's really a fantastic idea. Thank you, Saheli. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you very much for this opportunity and this platform to speak so much about my research and future plans. Thank you.
Well, I started thinking about electrical plugs and wall sockets. Now I'm seeing standards everywhere. That's what STS does to you. It gets in there and it makes you think. And think about everything. If you know someone interested in the things we do here in STS, please just ask them to get in touch. Maybe it's to explore innovation and diplomacy. Maybe it's to study how technology impacts us and how we, in turn, impact technology. Or maybe, just maybe, they're interested in the history of all this, and they want to study things like the origin of standard time, or standard measures, or even standard people. These all fit under the umbrella of Science and Technology Studies, or STS. We are a thriving community here at UCL, and there's always room for more. Music today included two pieces, Rollin' at 5 and Spyglass, both by Kevin MacLeod and both from the website filmmusic.io. WeAreSTS is a production of the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. If you want to find out more about the show, listen to past episodes, or just give us some feedback, please visit us online. Here's the address. It's ucl.ac.uk/STS/podcast. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for listening. We'll have another episode ready soon. Until then, just remember, there's knowledge to be found just about everywhere, and together, we are STS. Bye now.
You have been listening to We Are STS, a podcast from the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. Subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to find out more about the show, visit us online. The address is ucl.ac.uk/SDS/podcast.